On the morning of April 30th, 1943, a sardine fisherman named Jose Antonio Rey Maria was working the waters off the southern coast of Spain near a small town called Huelva. He found something floating in the sea. It was a body, a man in a military uniform, attached to a briefcase. The fisherman did what any reasonable person would do. He brought the body ashore and reported it to the local authorities. Within 48 hours, the documents in that briefcase had been photographed and handed to German intelligence. Within 2 weeks, Adolf Hitler had personally read them, and within 3 months, the course of the Second World War had shifted because of information contained in letters written by men who never sent them, describing plans that never existed, found on the body of a man who was never who he appeared to be. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat, and I think it's one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened. Here's the situation the Allied commanders faced in early 1943. The war in North Africa was nearly won. Rommel's forces were collapsing. The Allies were about to control the entire southern coast of the Mediterranean, and everyone, and I mean everyone, including the people trying to stop them, knew what came next. You look at a map. If you've just taken North Africa, where do you go? You go north. You cross the Mediterranean. You invade mainland Europe from the south. And the logical, obvious, practically unavoidable stepping stone is this island right here, Sicily. Sicily sits at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, just 150 kilometers from Tunisia, directly in the path of any northward push toward Italy. It has ports, it has airfields, it's the gateway to Europe. Every German strategist could see it. Every intelligence analyst could see it. Hitler could see it. In fact, Hitler was so convinced the Allies would target Sicily that he'd already begun reinforcing it. And herein lies the problem for the Allied commanders, specifically for a man named General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was planning exactly what everyone expected him to plan. If the Germans knew you were coming, an amphibious invasion became catastrophic. Amphibious landings are, even in ideal conditions, among the most dangerous military operations in existence. You're putting men in boats, in daylight, toward a defended shore. Every gun on the beach is zeroed in on the water. Every plane the enemy has is aimed at your ships. The men in those boats are exposed, slow-moving, and they can't retreat. Eisenhower needed something, anything, to make the Germans look somewhere else. And so, in the winter of 1943, a man named Ewen Montagu sat down and thought, what if we could convince Hitler that the invasion was coming somewhere completely different? What if we could plant false intelligence, not just a rumor, not just a vague signal, but a genuine, credible, official document that pointed the German military in the wrong direction? The plan seemed elegant in theory, but here's the question that should immediately occur to you. How? How do you get a document to the enemy that they will believe is real? You can't just send it. You can't walk into German headquarters and hand it over. The moment an enemy receives information that seems designed for them, they become suspicious of it. That's the fundamental paradox of deception. The more you want someone to believe something, the more they have reason to doubt it. The British had been working on this problem for years. They had an entire organization devoted to it, called the Double Cross System, in which they'd turned captured German spies and used them to feed false information back to Berlin. But what Montagu and his colleague Charles Cholmondeley were now imagining was something different, something bolder, something that had never been done at this scale before. They wanted to create a person, a fictional British officer, give him a name, a rank, a history, a personality, a girlfriend, financial troubles, plans for the future, and then, and this is the part that sounds insane, they wanted to make this fictional officer appear to have died in a plane crash at sea and wash his body ashore on the coast of neutral Spain with top-secret documents on his person, documents that would indicate the invasion was not going to Sicily, documents that would redirect the entire German war machine. One question had to be answered first, though. Where do you get a body? I want to pause here for a moment because this is the part of the story that tends to get glossed over, and I think it deserves more attention. The British government needed a human corpse. Specifically, they needed the corpse of a man who appeared to be a young, healthy military officer, someone whose death could plausibly result from drowning following a plane crash at sea. This was not a simple request. There are strict laws in Britain, even in wartime, about what can be done with a person's remains, and there are profound ethical questions about using a dead human being as a prop in a military operation, questions that the planners were aware of and wrestled with, even under the pressure of war. The man who solved this problem was a pathologist named Sir Bernard Spilsbury and a coroner's officer named Bentley Purchas. Purchas was the one who found the body. The man's name was Glyndwr Michael. He was a Welsh labourer born in 1909 who had drifted to London during the Depression years. He had no family to speak of, no stable home. He'd been found in a derelict warehouse in King's Cross in January 1943, unconscious and malnourished. He died 2 days later. The cause of death: he had eaten rat poison. Whether this was deliberate or accidental remains unknown. He was 34 years old. He was, in the bureaucratic language of wartime Britain, a suitable subject, an unclaimed body with no family to ask questions, no one who would mourn publicly or demand explanations. His death had been quiet, his life largely invisible to the system. Bentley Purchas arranged for the body to be preserved and kept in cold storage while the planners began the next phase of their work.
There is something quietly devastating about this, if you let yourself sit with it. Glyndwr Michael spent his life invisible. He ate rat poison in a warehouse and died alone. And then his body was borrowed by the British government to wear a false identity, carry false letters, and be dropped in the sea. He was never asked. He never consented. He was simply used. I think about that sometimes when I think about this story. But I also think about what happened next and what his unremarked life, in its strange afterlife, actually made possible. Now here's where the operation becomes genuinely extraordinary to me. Ewen Montagu and Charles Cholmondale didn't just need a body. They needed a person. They decided their fictional officer would be called Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They chose the name Martin because it was common enough to be unremarkable. They chose the Royal Marines because Marines regularly carried sensitive documents in transit.
But here is the insight that I think is so elegant it deserves its own moment. Montagu understood that the Germans would not just read the documents. They would investigate Major William Martin. They would check everything. They would look for inconsistencies. They would probe every detail of his life. So every detail had to be real. Not plausible, real. Or rather, real enough that the investigation confirmed it. Here is a partial list of what Montagu and his team created. Identity documents, a naval identity card with a photograph, not of Glyndwr Michael, but of a living officer who resembled him, a letter of credit from Lloyd's Bank, a combination ticket for the Naval and Military Club. Personal correspondence, a letter from his father, a letter from his solicitor about a disputed inheritance, a love letter, 2 love letters actually, from a woman named Pam. Pam was a real person, a secretary at MI5 named Jean Leslie, who agreed to be the inspiration for the character. The letters were heartbreaking in their specificity. They talked about missing each other, about their recent engagement, about the ring, which had been hard to find because of the war. There was a note about how he'd been so distracted with work that he hadn't been able to spend enough time with her. There was an apology. There were small, mundane, private things that no one forges, because no one forges things that small. Financial evidence. An overdraft bill from Lloyd's Bank, a bill from the Naval and Military Club, a tailor's invoice. Because what officer doesn't have bills? Entertainment stubs. Ticket stubs from a London theater, dated just before the supposed departure. Because what officer, on his last night in London before a dangerous mission, doesn't take his girl to the theater? A photo. Tucked in his wallet, a photograph of Pam, Jean Leslie in a swimsuit, smiling on a sunny day, the kind of photo a man carries to remind himself what he's fighting for. And then there were the documents themselves.
The critical document was a personal letter from General Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Harold Alexander, Eisenhower's British deputy. It was written in the breezy, confidential tone of two senior officers communicating informally. It referenced a cover plan for an upcoming operation, and that cover plan, stated casually as though it were common knowledge between friends, was that the real invasion targets were Greece and Sardinia, and that Sicily was being used as a deliberate feint. Read that again. The letter said the Allies wanted the Germans to think they were going to Sicily, because they were actually going to Greece. It was a deception inside a deception inside a deception. The Germans would find a letter that said, "We want you to think Sicily is the target." Therefore, they would conclude, Sicily is not the target. This was the layer that made the whole thing sing.
And then Montagu made one more decision that I find almost unbearably clever. He made Major William Martin slightly disorganized. The letters from Pam were slightly crumpled, as though they'd been read and refolded many times. The theater stubs were dated 4 days before the supposed flight departure, as though Martin had meant to throw them away and forgotten. The overdraft notice had a slightly impatient tone, because a truly organized, detail-perfect packet of documents is suspicious. Real people are messy. Real people forget to throw things away. The Germans would find these imperfections, and the imperfections would make everything else feel true. There was a problem, though, a serious one. A body dropped in the sea near Spain needed to look like it had been there for a specific amount of time, consistent with a plane having crashed some days earlier. And a body that has been in cold storage for months does not look like a body that drowned last week.
This is where the science gets interesting. The British brought in pathologists to consult on the decomposition question. Specifically, they needed to understand, given the temperature of the Atlantic in late April, given the time the body would be in the water before being found, would the state of decomposition be consistent with the story they were telling? The answer required detailed modeling of sea temperature, bacterial activity, the rate of skin degradation in saltwater, and the appearance of lungs in a drowning victim versus other causes of death. There was a complication. Glyndwr Michael had died of rat poison, which affects the liver, not the lungs. A drowning victim's lungs fill with water. If a Spanish pathologist examined the body and found no water in the lungs, the whole thing collapsed.
The solution they found was this. The cold storage had slowed decomposition significantly, but the body would still be in better condition than expected for someone who had supposedly been in the water for days. They concluded, and this was a calculated risk, that a Spanish pathologist, under wartime conditions, with limited resources, performing a cursory examination at the request of the Navy, would not conduct a full autopsy. They were betting that the investigation would be superficial enough that the lung question would not arise. It was a gamble. They took it. But here's the thing I find remarkable about this phase of the operation. The British intelligence services were doing applied forensic science. They were running models. They were thinking about decomposition rates. They were doing the equivalent of a cold case detective working backwards from the crime scene, except the crime was a fiction they were designing in real time. This was operational thinking that, in a university setting, would look like a cross between pathology, physical oceanography, and material science. And they had to get it right, because there was no second chance.
On April 17, 1943, the body of Glyndwr Michael, now Major William Martin, Royal Marines, was placed inside a sealed canister packed with dry ice and loaded onto a British submarine called HMS Seraph. The submarine was under the command of Lieutenant Commander Bill Jewell, who was given only the information he needed to know. He was not told the full nature of the operation. He was told he was delivering a package. They sailed for southern Spain. The Spanish coast near Huelva was chosen for specific reasons. The local currents and prevailing winds meant that objects entering the water at a certain point would consistently wash ashore near the town. British intelligence had modeled this. They knew exactly where the body would go.
There was also something more subtle at work.
Huelva was home to a German intelligence agent, a man known to be in regular contact with the Abwehr, German military intelligence. He was known to have close relationships with local Spanish officials. If anyone was going to make sure the documents reached German hands, it was the network already in place at Huelva. The British weren't just dropping a body in the water. They were dropping it directly into German intelligence channels. In the early hours of April 30th, HMS Seraph surfaced approximately 1.5 miles from the Spanish shore, in darkness, in the gentle swell of the Atlantic. The canister was opened. The body of Major William Martin was prepared, dressed in full uniform, briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, letters in his breast pocket. A life preserver was attached, and then he was placed in the sea. Bill Jewell watched him drift toward shore. Then HMS Seraph dove and left. For the next several days, the team in London could do nothing but wait. Now, here's where the plan required something the planners couldn't control: the neutrality of Spain. Spain in 1943 was a complicated country. It was officially neutral, but Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator, had sympathies with Hitler. Germany and Spain had economic ties. There were German agents throughout the country, and the Spanish military had its own interests and its own internal politics. The question was, would the Spanish authorities return the documents to the British, as diplomatic protocol required of a neutral nation handling a military casualty, or would they, quietly, unofficially, perhaps without even being asked, allow the documents to be seen by German intelligence first? The British were counting on the second scenario. They structured the entire operation around it. When the fisherman José María brought the body ashore on April 30th, it was handed to the Spanish Navy. The local naval commander, a man named Eduardo Infantes Bernat, reported the discovery up the chain of command, and simultaneously, word reached the German agent in Huelva, a man named Adolf Klaus. Klaus moved quickly. He made contact with his superiors. The Spanish authorities were cooperative, if not actively complicit. The documents, still sealed in their envelopes, were removed from the briefcase, photographed, carefully dried and resealed, and returned to the briefcase within 72 hours. The Spanish informed the British military attaché in Madrid that the body had been found. They returned the briefcase. The British naval attaché, playing his role with some nerves, receipted everything and sent a coded telegram back to London. The telegram read, "Mincemeat returned," and in London, Montagu held his breath, because returning the briefcase meant nothing yet. The question was whether the Germans had actually opened the documents, and the question after that was whether they believed them.
The British had a way to check. They examined the envelopes, using laboratory techniques to analyze whether the seals had been broken and resealed. They looked at the thread and the wax. They looked at minute traces of moisture. The answer came back: yes, the documents had been opened, read, photographed, and replaced. Major William Martin had made contact. Let me now tell you what happened on the other side. The photographs of the documents were sent to Berlin. They arrived on the desk of the Abwehr, and from there they moved with unusual speed because the contents were so significant. Within days, the documents were being assessed at the highest levels of German military intelligence. And here is where we encounter something deeply interesting about human psychology. The German analysts who examined the documents were not stupid. These were professional intelligence officers. They were trained to be suspicious. Their entire job was to detect deception. And yet, they believed. Why? This is a question I think about a lot because it gets at something fundamental about how minds work, including our own. The first reason is quality. The documents were genuinely excellent forgeries. The signatures were authentic. The letterheads were correct. The language and tone were precisely what such communications sounded like. The paper was the right paper. Every detail that could be checked was correct. But here's the thing. Quality alone doesn't explain it. The Germans had good forgeries too. They knew that quality forgeries existed. They knew that the British had sophisticated intelligence operations. A skilled analyst encountering a perfect document might actually be more suspicious, because how often does something perfect arrive unexpectedly? The second reason is something deeper, something that I think explains a lot more.
The Germans believed the documents because they were already looking for evidence that the invasion was not going to Sicily. Not because they doubted Sicily, they thought Sicily was the obvious target, but precisely because it was so obvious, they had a persistent anxiety that they were missing something, that the Allies were doing something clever, that the apparent obviousness was itself a trick. This is a documented cognitive pattern that psychologists now call motivated reasoning, combined with confirmatory anxiety. You expect the world to be more complicated than it appears, so when evidence arrives that confirms your suspicion that you've been misled, you embrace it because it fits your sense of how the world works, which is, nothing is as simple as it looks. The letter from General Nye did something very specific. It said, "We are using Sicily as a cover plan." In other words, we want you to think Sicily. We are actively engineering your belief in Sicily.
The moment a German intelligence officer read that, his brain did something predictable. It updated. Oh, so Sicily is the cover. Of course, that's why it seemed so obvious. And now the real question became, where are they actually going? The letter said, Sardinia and Greece. There's a lesson here that goes well beyond military history. If you want someone to believe something, don't tell them directly. Give them evidence that they believe they've discovered themselves. And if possible, and this is the genius move, make the thing you want them to believe feel like the conclusion to a chain of reasoning they've independently arrived at. Major Martin's documents did not say, the invasion is going to Greece and Sardinia. They said, the cover plan is Sicily, and we hope you believe it. And the Germans, reading that, concluded through their own logic, the invasion is going to Greece and Sardinia. They felt they had seen through the deception, which meant they never questioned whether the deception themselves were the deception.
The documents reached Adolf Hitler on May 12, 1943. He read them personally, and he believed them. The record of what followed is extraordinary in its directness. On May 12th, the same day he received the documents, Hitler sent an order: reinforce the Greek islands. Specifically, Sardinia and the Peloponnese must be made into fortresses. 4 days later, he issued another directive, this one regarding the entire Mediterranean strategy. The key passage, which intelligence officers would later read with something approaching disbelief, essentially described the Allied cover plan for Sicily as a real threat and ordered preparations accordingly. More than that, Hitler specifically instructed that Rommel, one of his most capable generals, be sent to Greece to prepare for the expected Allied assault. Rommel went to Greece. He never fought in Sicily. Meanwhile, the German commander in Sicily, Albert Kesselring, found his requests for reinforcements being deprioritized. The panzer divisions he needed were redirected. The coastal defenses he wanted to strengthen received less material than he'd requested. The Axis forces defending Sicily on July 9, 1943, the day the Allied invasion began, were significantly weaker than they would have been if Operation Mincemeat had never happened. And they were psychologically off balance, because even as the invasion began, Hitler and his senior commanders initially refused to believe Sicily was the real target. They thought it was a feint. They expected the main assault to come in Greece any day. They waited. The Allied forces crossed the beaches. The largest amphibious operation in history up to that point proceeded with far lower casualties than military planners had projected as the likely cost of a defended landing. 1 dead man, 1 briefcase, 1 chain of carefully constructed lies, and the Germans looked the wrong way.
Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, began on July 9, 1943, with the largest armada ever assembled. Over 3,000 ships, 150,000 troops, landings on a 160-kilometer front. In 38 days, the Allies took the island. The casualties on the Allied side were significant, approximately 22,000 killed, wounded, or missing. But military historians who have studied the operation have generally concluded that the casualties would have been dramatically higher without the misdirection created by mincemeat. The coastal defenses were weaker, the reserves were thinner, the command structure was confused. The fall of Sicily led directly to the fall of Mussolini.
Within weeks of the Allied landing, the Italian Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. He was arrested. Italy began secret negotiations with the Allies. The southern front of the Axis partnership began to crumble.
None of this is traceable in a straight line back to one operation. Wars don't work like that, but the thread is there if you follow it. Glyndwr Michael died in a warehouse in January 1943. 6 months later, Mussolini was removed from power. I'm not saying one caused the other. I'm saying the connection exists. The chain is real. A man whose death was unmourned, unrecorded, essentially erased from the normal accounting of human life, that man's body, used in a deception, contributed to a cascade of events that changed the shape of the war. What do we do with that? I genuinely don't know. I find it humbling in a way I struggle to articulate. Here's something that doesn't get mentioned enough. For Operation Mincemeat to work, not just in the moment, but permanently, it had to stay secret. If the Germans ever learned that Major William Martin was a fiction, they would reevaluate every conclusion they'd drawn from his documents. They would try to reconstruct what they'd missed. They might, even after the fact, identify what the real Allied strategy had been and adjust accordingly for future operations.
More importantly, if any enemy power learned that the Allies had run this kind of operation once, they would be on guard for it happening again. So the British sealed everything. The files were classified. The men and women who had worked on the operation were forbidden from speaking about it. Ewen Montagu wrote a book about it years after the war, The Man Who Never Was, published in 1953, when enough time had passed that the strategic sensitivity had diminished. But even then, he obscured certain details. The real identity of Glyndwr Michael was kept secret for decades. His name wasn't officially confirmed until 1996, 53 years after his body was used. In 1998, a headstone was placed on his grave in Huelva, Spain, where his body had been buried following the Spanish authorities' recovery. The headstone reads, "Glyndwr Michael, served as Major William Martin, R.M., known unto God." He'd been buried in Spain for 55 years before his real name was publicly acknowledged.
I think about what it means to keep a secret like that. Not for reasons of vanity or profit, but because the mission required it, because more lives might depend on the enemy never knowing what had been done. That kind of discipline, collective, institutional, sustained over decades, is almost impossible to imagine today. In an age of WikiLeaks and social media and the permanent digital record, information wants to be free, we say. But sometimes, the keeping of a secret is itself a form of service. I want to zoom out now, because I think Operation Mincemeat is not just a remarkable story. I think it teaches us something important about how minds work, including our own minds today. We tend to think of deception as something that happens to the credulous, to people who aren't paying attention, to people who aren't smart enough to see through it. But that's not what we find when we study the psychology of belief formation.
The German intelligence analysts who assessed the Mincemeat documents were some of the most sophisticated analytical minds in the German military. They had resources, they had training, they had every incentive to be critical, and they were fooled. Not because they were stupid, but because they were human. There are 3 cognitive principles at work in what happened, and all 3 apply to us. The first is motivated reasoning. We don't evaluate evidence neutrally. We evaluate it in the context of what we already believe, what we fear, and what we want. The German analysts feared that they were missing something, that the Allies were too clever to do the obvious thing. That fear made them receptive to evidence that confirmed the fear. The Mincemeat documents said, in effect, yes, you're right to be suspicious, and that was exactly what they wanted to hear. We do this constantly, when we read news articles, when we evaluate job candidates, when we assess medical symptoms. We are not neutral processors. We are motivated reasoners.
The second is source laundering. The documents that Montagu planted didn't come from an Allied source. They came from a dead British officer, found by a neutral country, passed through an intelligence network, and arrived in German hands appearing to be stolen. The path of transmission itself created credibility.
This is a principle that disinformation researchers study today. Information is more likely to be believed if it appears to have passed through multiple hands and survived scrutiny along the way. The longer the chain, the more credible the conclusion seems, even if the chain itself is fabricated. You see this in modern misinformation. A false claim doesn't spread as a false claim. It spreads as something that so many people are saying, that has been documented, that was confirmed by multiple sources. The chain is the credibility, and the chain itself is often fake.
The third is the reversal paradox. The mincemeat documents told the Germans that the British wanted them to believe X. The Germans therefore concluded X is false, not X is true. But the British knew the Germans would do this, so they structured the lie as an apparent anti-deception, knowing the Germans would reverse it. This is a second-order manipulation, and it worked because people find it genuinely hard to maintain uncertainty across multiple layers of inference. Once you feel like you've seen through something, you stop looking. Think about that in terms of modern life. When you feel like you've figured something out, when you feel the satisfaction of having seen past the official story, past the mainstream narrative, past the obvious conclusion, that feeling of insight is not evidence that you're right. It might be precisely the state of mind that someone is trying to induce. Feeling like you've seen through a deception is what the deception was designed to make you feel. I'm not saying be paranoid. I'm saying the smarter you feel in the moment of revelation, the more carefully you should check.
Here's a question I've been turning over since I first learned this story. Could Operation Mincemeat work today? Let's think through it. A body washes ashore in 2024 carrying a briefcase. Within hours, the Spanish authorities would run the fingerprints through Interpol databases. They would check the dental records against national databases. They would cross-reference the identity documents against digital government records. A document forger in 1943 needed to produce something that looked authentic under visual inspection. A document forger today would need to produce something that passes digital verification, biometric checks, and blockchain-backed record systems. The love letters? Modern intelligence analysts would look for metadata in digital correspondence. They'd check whether the people mentioned actually had verifiable online histories. They'd cross-reference social media profiles, photos, location data. The theater stubs? Every venue now generates electronic purchase records tied to credit cards. There's no ticket stub that exists in isolation from a database.
In other words, Major William Martin would be unmasked in approximately 72 hours. But here's the counterpoint. Modern deception doesn't work by planting a briefcase. It works at scale. It works through networks of fake accounts, algorithmically amplified content, and the flood of information that makes any single false claim harder to isolate and examine. The 2016 U.S. election interference, Cambridge Analytica, state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, these are not single acts of elegant deception. They are carpet bombing, thousands of false claims, amplified millions of times, until the signal-to-noise ratio breaks down and people stop believing anything. In a way, the problem hasn't gotten simpler, it's gotten worse. The briefcase deception required extraordinary craft because there was only one. Digital deception works because there are millions of briefcases, and you can't check them all. What Montagu and Cholmondeley did with extraordinary effort in 1943 can now be done at industrial scale with a laptop and a subscription to a language model. That's not a comforting thought, but I think it's an important one.
I want to come back to Glyndwr Michael, not Major William Martin, Glyndwr Michael. We know very little about him. That is itself part of the point. He was born on January 4th, 1909, in Aberbargod, a mining town in South Wales. His father died when he was 15, suicide according to some accounts. His mother died when he was in his early 20s. He moved to London, as many people without prospects did, looking for work. The Depression had made work scarce. He drifted. What he did in those years between arriving in London and dying in that warehouse, we don't know. There's almost no record. He fell through the cracks, in the way that people without money, without family, without institutional connections tend to fall through the cracks. He was found unconscious on January 26, 1943. He died on January 28th.
His death was recorded, the cause was noted, and then Bentley Purchase made arrangements for his body to be held for a purpose he couldn't reveal. When the operation was over, Major William Martin was buried in Huelva. Glyndwr Michael went with him, not just metaphorically but physically, the same body, the same ground. For 53 years, only a handful of people in the world knew his real name. And I keep thinking about this. In the official history of the Second World War, in the monuments and the museums and the school curricula, there is no plaque for Glyndwr Michael. His contribution is categorically different from a soldier's sacrifice. He didn't choose it. He didn't know about it. He wasn't there. He just happened to die in a way that made him useful. And yet,
the body that washed ashore near Huelva, the briefcase, the letters, the theater stubs, the girlfriend's photograph, the overdraft notice, all of it wrapped around the mortal remains of a man from a Welsh mining town who ate rat poison in a derelict warehouse. That's who fooled Hitler. Not a genius spy, not a decorated hero, a man that history had already forgotten. There's something in that I find almost unbearably interesting. The idea that the course of great events can hinge not just on the decisions of powerful men, but on the existence of powerless ones. That history, at its most contingent, doesn't care about rank or intention or legacy. It just needs a body. Glyndwr Michael. Remember the name.
Operation Mincemeat entered the canon of military history almost immediately after it was declassified. Ewen Montagu's book became a bestseller. A film was made in 1956. Ben McIntyre wrote a definitive account in 2010 that became the basis for a 2022 film with Colin Firth playing Montagu. But I think the deeper legacy is something harder to see. The operation demonstrated something that military and intelligence services had theorized but never quite proved at this scale, that a single, well-constructed deception executed with sufficient craft could have strategic consequences out of all proportion to its size. This insight was not lost on the architects of subsequent Allied operations. D-Day, the Normandy invasion of June 1944, was preceded by Operation Bodyguard, the most elaborate deception in the history of warfare. Fake armies, fake radio traffic, fake General Patton commanding a fake invasion force pointed at Pas-de-Calais, while the real force assembled in secret for Normandy. Bodyguard was mincemeat at industrial scale. It worked in part because mincemeat had worked, because the institutional knowledge of how to build and execute strategic deception had been developed and refined, and because Hitler, once fooled, proved susceptible to being fooled again. There's something darkly funny about that, in a way that I suspect Montagu would have appreciated. The very success of mincemeat may have contributed to German willingness to accept the bodyguard deception. Having been manipulated once, their analytical framework for assessing Allied intentions had been quietly corrupted. They had trusted themselves too much after mincemeat, because they'd felt they'd seen through it. Deception compounds. I want to leave you with a question. Operation Mincemeat is celebrated as a triumph of ingenuity, and it was. The craft, the precision, the psychological sophistication, remarkable.
But I want to ask, what are the conditions that made it possible? The first condition was genuine need. The alternative to a successful deception was an amphibious assault against a prepared enemy, with casualties that the British estimated would be catastrophic. Mincemeat existed because the alternative was worse. The second condition was institutional trust. This operation involved dozens of people across multiple intelligence services, government departments, and military branches. Every one of them kept the secret for decades. That kind of collective discipline doesn't emerge from nowhere. It comes from organizations that have built genuine cultures of purpose and accountability. The third condition was epistemic humility in the planners. Montagu didn't assume the operation would work because it was clever. He stress-tested it constantly. He imagined being the German analyst receiving the documents, and he kept asking, what would make me suspicious? Then he fixed it. Then he asked again. He was paranoid about the limits of his own thinking.
And I think that's the quality that most distinguishes brilliant deception from wishful thinking. Not the cleverness of the original idea, but the willingness to keep asking, what am I missing? That quality is useful in intelligence work. It's also useful in science. It's useful in business.
It's useful in ordinary human relationships. The people who get fooled are not, in general, the people who are less intelligent. They're the people who stop asking that question. What am I missing? Major William Martin was the man who never was, but the question he teaches us to ask is one that should never stop. Thanks for watching. A few things that didn't fit the main video. On The Spanish Pathologist, a doctor named Eduardo Fernández del Torno performed the examination of the body. His report listed cause of death as drowning and immersion in the sea. He did not conduct a full autopsy. The British gamble had paid off. His report is still in the Spanish archives.
On Jean Leslie, the woman whose photograph was placed in Major Martin's wallet, Jean Leslie, who became Pam, was a young MI5 secretary. She survived the war, married, had children, and lived until 2009. She gave 1 or 2 interviews in her later years, but was characteristically modest about her role. She once said, approximately, "I was just the girl in the photograph." On the briefcase. The briefcase used in the operation was a standard black civilian briefcase. It is now in the National Archives in Kew. You can go and look at it. Exhibit reference ADM 223/794. It looks exactly like what it is, a small, slightly scuffed leather briefcase, the kind anyone might carry, the kind no one would look at twice.
On Huelva, the grave of Glyndwr Michael, Major William Martin, is in the municipal cemetery of Nuestra Señora de la Soledad in Huelva, Spain. It is plot 12, row 7, grave 1. The headstone, placed in 1998, reads, William Martin, born 29th March 1907, died 24th April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. The dates are false, the parents are false, the name is false, but the body is real, and the grave is real, and anyone can visit.